Hey guys, so I asked in the last video if any of you wanted a video on MSG, and a fair number of you did. And honestly, I've been asked to do an MSG video probably 20 times in the last 2 or 3 years, so a long time coming, I guess. Normally what I would do when investigating, quote unquote, I'm not an expert in nutrition or anything like that, but just for myself, if I want to know the truth about some sort of food, some sort of ingredient like MSG, what I would normally do is defer to the experts, right? So like a dietetic organization or a site like Harvard Health that has a lot of good, comprehensive information on numerous things, like soy, for instance. Also looking at meta-analyses and systematic reviews on the topic. Barring that, just, looking to publications that I trust, that normally have good, seemingly good information, and seeing if they have articles on the topic. But that's pretty boring. That makes for a pretty boring video. And it also doesn't do what I think a lot of you want me to do, which is answer all of the claims, or at least the common claims that people have, in this case, against MSG. So in the case of MSG, the research is mostly concerned with headaches, flushing, muscle tightness, these transient symptoms that comprise the so-called Chinese restaurant syndrome. On the other hand, people who are promoting this anti-MSG narrative, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? They're saying that MSG is actually dangerous, that it causes way worse problems than just headaches. So I Googled, literally, MSG is bad, and the first relevant result that I got was this MSG is dangerous, the science is in, written by food renegade Kristen Michaelis, who considers herself a rebel because she likes to eat red meat. It's essentially the diet equivalent of conservatism is the new punk rock. She also drinks raw milk, which I guess is actually rebellious in I don't care if I end up paralyzed with barely functioning kidneys sort of way. But let's give Kristen some amount of credit. Unlike most alt-med granola crunchy sites, she does actually include a list of sources. And right off the bat, there's a pretty obvious potential problem. They're all pretty old. 1998, 2000, 1997, 1998, 1986, 2007, 1998, 2007, and 2002. Now, if Kristen posted this in, say, 2008, then that might not be a problem. Now, I couldn't find an actual date for the article, but the comments give us a pretty good indication. The first one was published November 27th, 2012. But still, it's possible that nothing else was published after 2007, her latest reference. Of course, that's not true. Here's a review from 2009, Monosodium Glutamate Allergy, Menace or Myth. Here's another from 2010, Glutamate, its applications in food and contribution to health. And here's another from even earlier, 2006, Reconsidering the Effects of Monosodium Glutamate, a literature review. So clearly there's far more research than just the 9 sources that Kristen is referencing. Oh, and actually that's 7 sources, since 7 is a duplicate of 4 and 8 is a duplicate of 6. In any event, I really wonder why Kristen chose to ignore these 3 reviews that I mentioned, especially considering they are reviews. They're actually looking at the evidence, looking at the various studies, and trying to come to a conclusion. Despite concerns raised by early reports, decades of research have failed to demonstrate a clear and consistent relationship between MSG ingestion and the development of these conditions. These conditions referring to asthma attacks, hives, swelling associated with hives, and stuffy nose. Despite a widespread belief that glutamate can elicit asthma, migraine headache, and Chinese restaurant syndrome, there are no consistent clinical data to support this claim. In addition, findings from the literature indicate that there is no consistent evidence to suggest that individuals may be uniquely sensitive to glutamate. Despite a widespread belief that MSG can elicit a headache, among other symptoms, there are no consistent clinical data to support this claim. Findings from the literature indicate that there is no consistent evidence to suggest that individuals may be uniquely sensitive to MSG. So yeah, I lied. I know exactly why Kristen didn't include these sources, because they directly contradict her narrative that MSG is dangerous. And really, we could just stop here if you want. It's pretty clear that Food Renegade is not a reliable source when it comes to MSG. really when it comes to anything to do with nutrition, I mean, that was made clear with the About page. But since we're having so much fun, let's go ahead and keep going and actually look at her sources. All 9 of them, but really 7 of them. Why? Why did she cite them twice? So the first one is Food Allergy. It's written by Dr. Dean Metcalfe and published in Primary Care Clinics and Office Practice in 1998. So Kristen references this here when she's talking about supposed typical symptoms that people experience after consuming MSG. So here's what Dr. Metcalfe actually says in this 1998 article overall on food allergy. There's just a tiny section on MSG. Here's what he says. MSG in sufficient quantity, usually greater than 6 grams, can lead to a transient syndrome consisting of a warmth or burning sensation, especially over the head and shoulders, stiffness or tightness, extremity weakness, pressure, tingling, headache, lightheadedness, and gastric discomfort occurring approximately 15 minutes after ingestion, and wheezing in some asthmatics, although this latter symptom is controversial. And this is all referencing the book, the second edition of Food Allergy, Adverse Reactions to Foods and Food Additives, written by Catherine M. Wosner and Ronald A. Simon, and edited by Simon, Metcalfe, and Hugh A. Sampson. More on this in a minute. So back to the quote and Kristen's interpretation of it. Again, Metcalfe says, MSG in sufficient quantity, usually greater than 6 grams, can lead to, etc. That's really interesting. I wonder why Kristen didn't include the part about the amount, the greater than 6 grams, in her little section on common symptoms. I'm lying again. I know why. Because 6 grams of MSG is a lot. 1/4 teaspoon of MSG is about 1 gram. Apparently, you only need about half of a teaspoon in a recipe containing 4 to 6 servings. So even if you were to eat, say, like a whole casserole containing half of a teaspoon of MSG, that's still only 2 grams total. Of course, people are mostly concerned about the MSG in Chinese food, even though MSG is present in a lot of different cuisine and occurs in certain foods, like naturally. But it doesn't make sense to think that they are using that much more MSG in like a lo mein or whatever, because there are consequences to that. MSG becomes unpalatable at certain levels. Like you can taste it and it doesn't taste good. So yeah, she didn't mention the 6 grams because it destroys her argument that any of this is meaningful. Again, if the average person is consuming like half of a gram to a gram per meal and these transient symptoms only show up after 6 grams, then none of this matters. But it gets worse for Kristen. So, as I said, I would talk more about the second edition of Food Allergy. It's the second edition. The second edition is not the latest edition. There have been 3 more since. The latest 5th edition was published in 2013, which of course is after Kristen published her post in like 2012, but the 4th edition came out in 2009. I wonder why she would have relied on such an old article referencing such an outdated edition. So unfortunately, I couldn't gain access to this book without paying over $100, which, spoiler alert, didn't do that, but there are some kind of context clues that we can follow that give us a pretty good idea of what the 4th edition says. In the chapter on MSG, there is a citing literature section that lists research that has cited the book. The only thing listed is the 2009 review I mentioned earlier, MSG Allergy, Menace or Myth, written by Williams and Wosner, and it concluded that the evidence showing a relationship between MSG and Chinese restaurant syndrome is seriously lacking. Wait a minute! Look who wrote the chapter on MSG for the 4th edition of Food Allergy. Catherine M. Wosner. So given that both of these were written or co-written by the same person within a year of each other, I think it's pretty safe to say that they come to roughly the same conclusion on MSG. While there is some evidence to suggest that large doses of MSG, more than 3 grams, ingested on an empty stomach without food may elicit some of the symptoms of the MSG symptom complex, it would be inappropriate to conclude that MSG consumed as part of a typical Western diet would be likely to induce such symptoms. So source number 1, busted. I'm sorry. So source number 2. Additive-Induced Hives, Experience with MSG by Ronald A. Simon, published in 2000 in the Journal of Nutrition. So according to Kristen, this study shows that hives or other allergic type reactions with the skin are typical MSG complaints. Let's see what the study actually says. In conclusion, these data would indicate that MSG is a distinctly uncommon cause or exacerbant of chronic urticaria, if it induces urticaria at all. We were certainly unable to demonstrate MSG-induced hives in any of our chronic urticaria patients, even those who believed MSG provoked their hives in the past. And this really isn't surprising at all, given that Dr. Simon has helped edit Food Allergy, which again is a book that does not support the claim that MSG causes hives. Source number 3. The MSG Symptom Complex, Assessment in a Double-Blind, Placebo-Controlled, Randomized Study, published in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology in 1997. So according to Kristen, this study shows that MSG causes muscle tightness, fatigue, numbness, or tingling, and flushing in sensitive people. So this was actually a study on 61 patients, at least in the first study. They were given either a drink with no MSG, so the placebo, or a drink with 5 grams of MSG on an empty stomach. There was some evidence that the participants experienced headaches and flushing above 2.5 grams. 2.5 grams on an empty stomach, no food. As the researchers themselves say, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology concluded that an effect of MSG will be seen only when MSG is ingested on an empty stomach and when large doses, 3 grams or more of MSG or other free glutamate, are consumed without food. Our results support this conclusion. Now, they still contend in the paper that their results are relevant to the way that we consume MSG because it's possible that we don't consume all of our MSG in a meal like equally throughout the meal, like maybe we're consuming most of it at the beginning of the meal, and that this is akin to receiving MSG on an empty stomach. But others are not convinced. From this 2006 review that I mentioned earlier, one must still consider that the MSG would soon be accompanied by food and would be metabolized more slowly with food than without. And of course, there are many more studies to consider, like this double-blind from 1993. Rigorous and realistic scientific evidence linking the Chinese restaurant syndrome to MSG could not be found. Then there's this double-blind from 2000. Neither persistent nor serious effects from MSG ingestion are observed, and the responses were not consistent on retesting. And of course, there are reviews like the 2006 one and works like Food Allergy that have looked at the evidence on the whole and don't believe that it supports a relationship between MSG and headaches, muscle tightness, etc. So source number 3 does support her point, but only if you are only looking at that study, only looking at the researchers' interpretation of their study, not taking into account other interpretations, and not taking into account other research. Source number 4, Dr. Russell Blaylock's Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills, published in 1998. And I'm kicking myself for getting rid of this copy years ago. Yes, I actually had a copy of this. I was a good little 80-10-10er, and we all had a copy of this because it was proof, right? Proof that things like MSG and aspartame are bad for your brain. So for those not in the know, Russell Blaylock is like an actual neurosurgeon who did actual work like back in the 70s. For instance, he helped develop like a new way of operating on brain tumors. But today he is more known for being anti-vax, anti-fluoride, anti-GMO, for thinking that chemtrails are real, proving yet again that seemingly the more educated you are, the more prone you are to believing quackery. And just a little aside, why are people still insisting that the left is more anti-science when people like Blaylock show up on right-wing conspiracy sites like Newsmax and InfoWars? Pretty sure there are crazy people on both sides. And hey, at least the left believes in climate change. Just saying. But anyway, back to Kristen. Apparently, she finds Blaylock's musings on MSG very compelling, considering she cites him multiple times. MSG overstimulates our nervous system, exciting our nerves and causing an inflammatory response. With time, these repetitive inflammatory responses cause our nerves to start producing more and more nerve cells that are sensitive to this kind of stimulation. The more overly sensitive nerve cells we have, the stronger our immediate response to MSG will be. So basically, MSG and other excitotoxins cause brain damage. This is the crux of Blaylock's book. Of course, it's nonsense because MSG doesn't really enter the brain. Glutamate is metabolically compartmentalized in the body and generally does not passively cross biologic membranes. Hence, almost no ingested glutamate, MSG, passes from gut into blood, and essentially none transits placenta from maternal to fetal circulation or crosses the blood-brain barrier. Studies in vivo show that glutamate does not enter the brain in appreciable quantities except in those small regions with fenestrated capillaries. This organization does not allow net glutamate entry to the brain. Rather, it promotes the removal of glutamate and the maintenance of low glutamate concentrations in the extracellular fluid. This explains studies that show that the blood-brain barrier is impermeable to glutamate even at high concentrations. That last source was published in 2009, so well before Kristen posted her little article. It's something that she easily could have discovered herself, literally just by Googling blood-brain barrier MSG. But MSG is dangerous, so... Alright, source number 5. Behavioral and endocrinological effects of single ingestions of MSG in the mouse. This was published in 1986 in Neurobehavioral Toxicology and Teratology. It's now called Neurotoxicology and Teratology. According to Kristen, this study on mice proves that MSG causes radical hormone fluctuations that result in obesity, inactivity, and other hormone issues. As this 2014 review concludes, controlled studies involving the addition of MSG to the diet of animals and humans, often in extremely large doses over extended periods of time, show no effect on body weight. The studies that Kristen and others rely on to show a link between obesity and MSG rely on large dose injections given to mice. These aren't relevant to humans and how we consume MSG because, again, glutamate is metabolically compartmentalized in the body and generally does not passively cross biologic membranes. And the few population studies on humans that have found a link between MSG and weight gain aren't convincing because we don't just consume MSG. We consume MSG in meals containing MSG. And meals containing MSG, again, something like lo mein, tend to be high-calorie meals. And these types of meals are correlated with a less healthy lifestyle in general. You know, not exercising, not getting enough sleep, consuming lots of alcohol. Any of these can explain weight gain. So again, controlled studies involving the addition of MSG to the diet of animals and humans show no effect on body weight. So the next 3 sources are Blaylock again. Apparently, humans are 20 times more sensitive to MSG than monkeys, 5 times more sensitive than rats, and that's why we can apply studies on animals, like the mouse study that I just mentioned. That's why we can apply them to humans. What? MSG is especially harmful for babies, even though, again, essentially none of the MSG a pregnant woman consumes gets to the fetus. And now for the final reference. A high dietary intake of sodium glutamate as flavoring causes gross changes in retinal morphology and function, published in 2002 in Experimental Eye Research. So according to Kristen, this study proves that over time, MSG damages our retinas. This is another one that I unfortunately could not access, but according to the British Nutrition Foundation, the relevance of the study to human health is of questionable importance, primarily because, number 1, it's a study on rats, and number 2, they fed the rats huge amounts of MSG, 20 grams per 100 grams of feed. Again, we eat far less MSG than that. So that's it. Really? We're done. Basically, MSG is fine. Now, obviously, that does not mean that you have to consume it. You know, if you are convinced that consuming something with a lot of MSG causes you a headache, it's probably the nocebo effect, but that doesn't mean that the pain is any less real for you. But I hope you can see that there is a huge difference between, for me, for whatever reason, MSG just seems to bother me, so I try to avoid it, and MSG is dangerous. The science is in. And also remember that MSG is not only in Chinese food, right? There's a lot of other food, even other cuisine, like Italian food, that is full of ingredients that are full of MSG. So if you are only experiencing MSG sensitivity after consuming Chinese food, it's not the MSG. I mean, there's no reason to believe that it's the MSG anyway. It could be too much salt. I mean, look, Chinese food's really salty. Italian food is also really salty. Pretty much all restaurant food is really salty. And the final thing I'll say is that, remember, anytime we promote that a certain food ingredient is dangerous, is bad for us, we're inevitably encouraging more research. And more research inevitably means more animal research. These studies, it's not like they just injected the mice with MSG and they were fine. No, these animals were harmed. These animals were killed for stupid research. Not trying to get on my high horse or anything, but I'm just saying the more you people ask for research on genetic modification, research on MSG or whatever else, the more animal cruelty you are contributing to. I know I said I wasn't going to get on my high horse, but yeehaw, I'm here! Alright, thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. Of course, comments and questions down below. Subscribe, that's pretty cool. And if you want to support the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/unnaturalvegan. Thank you again, and I will have a new video very, very soon.